My name is Emma Chardy. I am the cataloger and LGBTQ subject specialist here at the Library Company. If this is your first time attending a Library Company of Philadelphia event, we're so happy that you could join us this evening. And if you've attended another one of our programs, welcome back. For those who may not be familiar, the Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. We are free and open to the public and house an extensive non-circulating collection of rare printed and graphic materials. The Charlotte Cushman Society was created in 2018 and is dedicated to recovering and sharing LGBTQ history. Every year, the Charlotte Cushman Society sponsors this event in October for LGBTQ History Month. So we want to make sure to thank all of our Charlotte Cushman Society members for helping us bring these events to life, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in getting involved to donate to the Society. You can find more information about that and other ways you can support the Library Company on our website. For this year's event, we are thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Rebecca Davis. Dr. Davis is the author of Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America, which was published in 2024. She received her PhD in American history from Yale University. She's currently a professor of history and women and gender studies at the University of Delaware, and she's also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and a research associate for the Council on Contemporary Families. If you have any questions during her presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Davis.
Thank you so much, Em, and also thanks to Grace Harrington and to the Charlotte Cushman Society and all of its supporters. I have lived in the Philadelphia area for 15 years and have long wanted to be able to do something in partnership with the Library Company, so I'm thrilled that this was the occasion. So I am going to talk this evening about the queer past that we can find in American history through some of the topics that I cover in my new book, and I'm really also looking forward to your questions at the end. I'm going to bring up my slides. All right. So identifying LGBTQ histories in the American past. What this means is that I think there are particular places we can look for these histories, and I'm also going to suggest that there are certain ways that might be less fruitful if we want to look for these histories. We're doing this now at a time when American life, even putting politics aside, American life is very conflicted over sexuality. On the one hand, we have a lot of talk about polyamory, even a New York Times Magazine cover story about a polycule in suburban Boston that was very gender fluid and queer and communitarian. At the same time that we have the Merriam-Webster dictionary putting tradwife into the dictionary, this new term referring to a movement for gender conservatism in which women ostensibly shun paid employment in order to devote themselves to mothering, housekeeping, and being a wife. So these conflicts are both unique to the time we live in and very much a part of the history that I'm going to talk about. So my talk this evening moves chronologically. I'm going to talk a little bit about LGBTQ histories in early America, 18th and 19th century possibilities for a queer life that we might not expect, 20th century shifts toward LGBTQ identities and some of the consequences of that. And then in my conclusion, I'm going to talk about our current history, our current battles over this very history. So let me start with early America. Now, I am a historian at the University of Delaware, and I teach a class on the history of sexuality in America. And I've been teaching that class since the fall of 2007. I've taught it many, many times, and I'm constantly shifting it around. But I was trained as a 20th century historian, and nothing has been more eye-opening and even revelatory to me than learning about gender and sexuality in early America. Because the way that that people 400, 500 years ago thought about gender and sexuality are radically different from the way that we usually conceptualize it or talk about it today. So we start before European arrival. If we think about Two-Spirit people throughout North America, Two-Spirit is the preferred word among Indigenous North Americans for gender expansive or what we might call sort of broadly queer people. We have found, scholars of this have found at least 155 different Indigenous nations in North America that had this type of person within their communities. Often these were people who entered the world as boys and dressed as women in adulthood. These people would perform tasks associated with women's work, such as weaving, food production. Sometimes, and there were different words for people who did this work and lived these roles depending upon which tribal nation they were part of. Sometimes these nations thought about the Two-Spirit person as someone who had both male and female within them, hence the language of the Two-Spirit, so that they're not either male or female, but rather embody both that duality. Sometimes it was a third gender. So the way that people thought about this varied across the continent. For the most part, though, these individuals were not understood to be living in anything that Christians would later call sinful. They often had important ceremonial roles or in carrying out the group's tradition. Sometimes they served as sexual partners to different men within the community, and they had important roles. When we talk about Two-Spirit people, when we talk about this early period, it's important the language that we use. So the words gay and lesbian, homosexual, those are, I think, limiting in understanding a period of time when the word wasn't yet invented and wouldn't have had meaning in the way that we talk about it today. But the existence of these Two-Spirit people was also really important to the process of colonization, conquest, and enslavement that happened with European arrivals. So one of the ways that we know about the diversity of Two-Spirit people is through the eyes and pens of Europeans who often thought very little of these folks. So we have this example from Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who was a Spanish man who landed on the Gulf Coast of what is today Florida and held captives there, as many of the Spanish arrivals did. And this language is really pejorative. I have a reason for using it because this is, as historians, we try to take even the sort of ugly language that people in the past used to talk about things they didn't understand to try to see what in fact they might have been describing in ways that honor those people. So he saw a man who was married to another man, and these be certain impotent, effeminate men. Perhaps he was seeing a Two-Spirit person who would not have been considered effeminate by other members of that Indigenous nation. They go about dressed as women, do women's tasks, and shoot with a bow and carry great burdens. In fact, the musculature that these Two-Spirit people had often made them extremely useful in women's domestic labor. They could carry more water. They could perform some of the heavy manual work of domestic labor. However, through the eyes of these Spanish and French and English and others, this gender expansive culture became a justification for violence, that these were people who were sinning, who lived outside the bounds of Christian ideas of morality, and therefore needed to be forced to conform to what the Europeans thought was appropriate. And there are also examples of women warriors within some of these Indigenous nations, and that also was very troubling to some of these Europeans. So what were the values these Europeans were bringing with them? Well, whether French or Spanish Catholics or English or Dutch Protestants, they brought with them a variety of ideas rooted in religion about sex as either something that a priestly class would abstain from if they were Catholic, or within a Protestant context, That was one of the things that made marriage so sacred. But for both Catholics and Protestants, marriage was the place for sex, legally or ethically speaking. These early people did not yet have a concept of women as being especially pure or chaste. In fact, Protestants in the 1600s and early 1700s still tended to look at women as temptresses, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, and as often more sexually persuasive or adventuresome than men were. Nevertheless, they had a lot of rules, some of which were based in law, some in custom, and some in their religious teachings. For Protestants, the problem in terms of sexual sin was of uncleanness, that there were behaviors a person could engage in that would make them unclean in the eyes of God. But gluttony could make a person unclean. Greed could make a person unclean. Pride. So it's not just same-sex acts or premarital sex that might make a person unclean, but any of these violations of their moral code. These were disorderly things. And a lot of it was about keeping order. So when we think about early America, we might have in mind these very stern Puritans, and everybody was sort of shaking in their boots, making sure they didn't break any of the rules. But that really isn't what we see when we look closer. The Well-Ordered Family is a very famous sermon that Benjamin Wadsworth gave in Boston in the early 1700s. And it was basically about marriage and family as ordering society like a little mini government. And that was really important. And here's where we get to this queer past. So one place we can try to understand the queer past is to look at who got in trouble for breaking the rules. So if we look at, for example, sodomy prosecutions. Again, if we're thinking of these very stern Puritans with their strict biblical law, we might expect to see a lot of sodomy prosecutions because we know that queer desire is a fairly common human trait. So in fact, and in English law, and as interpreted by the English Protestants who settled on the Atlantic coast, sodomy was a capital crime and it required witnesses. We know of only 2 people ever executed for sodomy in all of colonial New England. There were acquittals, there were convictions for attempted sodomy. In other words, it's almost as if these colonial courts went out of their way to lessen the charges to avoid an execution, to sort of find ways to either say there weren't enough witnesses or it was attempted, not completed. So they weren't even sure what made something sodomy. Did it have to involve penetration? And so on. So there were lots of debates in early America. There wasn't one view. And it was understood as an evil or sinful act. They weren't talking about the people who engaged in these behaviors as if they were a different class of people. This was sacrilegious and disorderly behavior, but it was not an expression of a sexual identity. In fact, far more of their time was spent worrying about non-marital sex between men and women. And fornication, sex with an unmarried woman, the marital status of the man doesn't matter. Fornication under English common law is sex with an unmarried woman. Marriage was what made sex lawful, and so this was unlawful behavior. Women were prosecuted for fornication more than any other crime in New England in the 1600s. It was also a common charge in the Chesapeake. Why? Because a woman who gets pregnant outside of marriage, what are you going to do about that well-ordered family? She's completely outside of that well-ordered family. Are the taxpayers or the town elders going to have to pay for the child's upkeep? It's a thing that creates chaos in these new settlements. So interracial fornication is soon through statute made to have harsher penalties. So I hope you can see here that it's not a clearly heterosexual versus homosexual society, but there are people engaging in queer sex, in queer love, in non-marital expressions of sexuality, and they're doing so in ways that only occasionally involve the courts. When we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, we see a world of possibilities when it comes to queer desires. And I'm using the word queer expansively to talk about what we would today put under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, but really things that were non-normative. So outside the bounds of what was considered proper in terms of sexuality, whether that be gender non-conforming or between two people of the same gender. So this is a classic primary source for historians of sexuality. It is one of my favorite. This was written about by Martin Duberman almost 40 years ago in a famous article. And he came upon these letters. Thomas Jefferson Withers and James Hammond became important people in the Confederacy. But as young men, they were also bedmates. Bed sharing was very common all throughout early America into the 19th century, sometimes because it was just very cold at night without central heating, often because people didn't have a guest room or guest bed, so everybody kind of piled in together. But it also seems that a lot of friends got in bed together and fooled around, had some fun, and that was okay. People weren't generally upset about it. In fact, Jeff Withers joked to Jim about some of the experiences they'd had. I feel some inclination to learn whether you yet sleep in your shirt tail and whether you yet have the extravagant delight of poking and punching a writhing bedfellow with your long fleshen pole, the exquisite touches of which I have often had the honor of feeling. And so he compares his friends' penis to a battering ram, right? So there's this joke about how Hammond is sort of sexually virile and enthusiastic in ways that are both sort of startling and perhaps also exciting to his male bedmates. But the other thing to keep in mind is that lots of people read one another's mail in the 18th and 19th centuries. That ideas of privacy that we might have were not as encoded then. So Thomas Jefferson Withers wrote about these experiences, probably understanding that people other than Jim would read the letter, and he wasn't worried about the consequences of that. Historians think that Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, probably had some sort of physical relationship with Joshua Speed. They shared a bed for a very long time. And Speed, in fact, invited Lincoln into his bed the first time they met. And at the time, Lincoln was 28 and getting ready to serve in the Illinois legislature. And Speed would later say of their friendship, quote, "No two men were ever more intimate," end quote. Now, the word intimacy can mean emotional intimacy, but there is, I think if we had a story of a man and a woman who shared a bed for 3 years and later described it as no two people were ever so intimate, our minds would quickly assume that the relationship had also been sexual. So what historians of these subjects try to remind us of is that why would we not assume that two men sharing a bed for 3 years who said that it was intimate were also not engaged in sexual behavior? One of the examples I write about a lot in my book is the relationship between Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus. These records are extraordinary, not only for what we learn about two women's passionate love for each other in the 1850s and 1860s, but because both Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus are African American, these are the only letters between two Black women in a relationship like this that historians have found. This is the only set. Addie Brown was a self-educated working class woman who likely met Rebecca Primus because Primus came from an educated middle class Black family in Connecticut who operated a sort of employment bureau out of their home for lower income Black people. And so Addie may have gone to them looking for help finding a job. She worked as a domestic servant, as a governess. She did all kinds of jobs. But she and Rebecca fell in love. And we have surviving at the Connecticut Historical Society, the letters that Addie wrote to Rebecca. Rebecca, through her because she had more material privilege, was able to save the letters, and she lived into her 90s. There's a school named after her in Maryland because she went to Maryland after the Civil War to teach freedmen as an educator, a beloved member of her community. But Addie died young and impoverished, and so the letters that Rebecca had written to her were lost to history. But I want to give you a sense of the extreme and beautiful passion in their correspondence. My dear friend, I no doubt you will be surprised to receive a letter so soon. My dearest, dearest Rebecca, my heart is almost broke. I don't know that I ever spent such hours as I have, my loving friend. And she says, it seemed to me this very moment, if only I had the wings of a dove, I would not remain long in Waterbury, although we can't always be together. Oh, 'tis hard, my loving friend. You would like to know how. And then she talks about her employer, Mr. Games, who has made some advances on her, and that she has not wanted to reciprocate that. I only want to be near you having one of those sweet kisses. And she says later about Mr. Games, no kisses is like yours. So she doesn't want Rebecca to think that she's enjoying this other person's kisses. So really beautiful, extraordinary letters between these two women, leaving no doubt that it was also an erotic relationship. Again, these were letters that they understood other people would read, possibly. They couldn't have the expectation of privacy. But also when Addie was visiting, she would stay with Rebecca in her room. Rebecca's parents knew that the two young women were bedmates. I thought it was appropriate, being hosted by the Charlotte Cushman Society, to also mention Charlotte Cushman. She was one of, if not the greatest Shakespearean actress of the age, and she often played male roles. She was most famous for playing Romeo, often with her sister in playing opposite her as Juliet. And she was described at the time by one of her fans as, quote, the incarnation of the ideal lover. Cushman is illustrated here in her theater costume as Romeo, but she also often wore masculine clothing when she was out and about, and she had female companions throughout her life. One woman, quote, could not help being very absurdly jealous of pretty Juliet when you drew her head against your bosom and kissed her. So she had fans who would write these adoring letters to her, female fans who would write these. And one wrote, oh, Miss Cushman is a very dangerous young man. We might have lots of different words we could marshal today to talk about someone like Charlotte Cushman. Was Cushman a transgender or a gender expansive person? In 2025, what pronouns would Charlotte Cushman have wanted to use? Can we describe Cushman as a lesbian, as transmasc? We can ask these questions. I don't know that they bring us closer to understanding how Cushman lived her life and what people at the time thought about Cushman. In fact, really seeing in her a sort of erotically charged female representation of masculine desire, right? So we can try to use words of the time to think about how popular she was. She was not arrested for any of this behavior, and because of her wealth and privilege, lived safely with female companions without facing any negative consequences. She was not arrested for same-sex behavior or anything like that. She was allowed to live a good life with her companions. So my concluding point for this section is that there was minimal state involvement around issues of queerness by the time, in the lifetime of Charlotte Cushman. These weren't associated with a sexual identity. People might say, oh, Cushman, she's a real man, but they were not saying that she was psychologically, sociologically a distinct kind of person. And this is really striking to me. According to the 1880 census, only 63 people in the entire country were imprisoned for sodomy at that time, right? So this is also not a period of time where young people, middle-aged people who are having queer relationships are worried about getting arrested for them. And what we're going to see are significant changes in the late 1800s that shift that dynamic, but that also bring about the modern LGBTQ movement. If I were teaching my class, I would pause now for questions. I'm eager to know what you're thinking, but I'll just take a breath. And as we move into this last section, know that I'm anticipating and looking forward to your questions later. So things dramatically shift in the United States regarding queer desire, LGBTQ people after the 1880s. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that there's generally more state surveillance of sexual behavior. This is not coincidentally the era when Jim Crow is taking over in the American South and other parts of the country as well, when it's extremely dangerous for interracial couples, when Black men are facing false allegations of rape and there's all kinds of terror against them, when Black women are fearing for their sexual safety around white men in the South in many instances. So we're really seeing different kinds of state power because it was Southern white sheriffs and judges who permitted that kind of sexual violence to persist. That is, taking shape in the country. More and more women who are suspected of being engaged in sex work are starting to get arrested. American cities are growing. There's more nightlife. There are more theaters and upper decks of theaters. There are more parks that can stay open late thanks to electric lighting by the end of the century. There are all kinds of shifting dynamics that draw police attention to sex work as a place for their involvement. But even more than that, there are more police. Part of what happens between the late 19th and the early 20th century is municipal reform. They want to have professionalized mayor's offices and they want to have professionalized police forces. And part of that shift in American political life means that police are proving their value. They are going to go out and show that they do things to clean up the city. And arresting people for those sort of sex-related crimes, morals crimes, becomes part of it. They also, by the 1910s, have started raiding different social locations to arrest people on suspicion of sodomy and of other sex crimes. But even being in the presence of people who are queer puts people at risk. So there was this raid in 1914 in Long Beach, California, which was reported widely in the press as like, oh, there's this network of them and they all get together and they, talk the same coded language and they wear the same kinds of clothes. And so we have to, infiltrate this network of these social vagrants, right? This vagrancy was one of the catch-all misdemeanors that they could arrest people under if they couldn't quite, land a felony charge of sodomy. So these were organized for immoral purposes, as the subheading says here. So these raids start to happen in Newport, Rhode Island, famously, in Portland, Oregon. And there are a series of these raids that get more and more regional and national news attention, educating Americans about the existence of these small but growing communities of queer people who get together to socialize, to meet, to listen to music, to find sexual partners, and that this was something that everyone should worry about and that the police should investigate. This is really new. It's proactively going out and looking for evidence of queer sexuality. With this, the thing that's being pursued is not just illegal or illicit or suspicious behaviors, but certain kinds of people. And in this, the police and others are aided by new theories from a field called sexology, the study of sexuality, the science of sex, and psychiatry, which talk about queerness as a mental illness. all of these increasing authorities over gay and lesbian life, queer life, really change the dynamic for gender nonconforming people in the United States, for people who have queer desires or engage in queer sex, or who in any way otherwise live outside a normative heterosexual marital life. And of course, as often happens, the people of color, people who are working class, poor, migrant, often face much harsher consequences criminally when these cases are brought into court. Sorry, my cat has captured a hairband. This is a really defending me well, and you can hear her yowling about it in the background. So immigration law, I thought I would emphasize this for no reason, but how important immigration law has been to defining queerness and to really raising the stakes for publicly identifying as anything other than heterosexual. So immigration restrictions, one of the earliest pieces of immigration restriction that Congress ever passed was the Page Act of 1875. And I mention it because it uses sexuality as a way to restrict the legal immigration of women from China. The Page Act says that a woman who is suspected of coming to the United States to be a sex worker may not remain in the country, may not enter the country legally. And this was designed to limit Chinese immigration more broadly. But by 1952, a major piece of immigration reform, the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act, included a prohibited category that was for the first time in US immigration law, and that category was the psychopathic personality. Now, this is a term from psychiatry that Congress wrote into this legislation through the lobbying and advisement of professional psychiatrists. Now, a psychopathic personality, according to the psychiatric definition, could include things like inveterate alcoholism, even schizophrenia. But as it was interpreted, it meant homosexuality. And so there were people who were turned away at the border or deported because they were gay or suspected of being gay or lesbian. And under immigration law, that meant they were a psychopathic personality, this sort of disruptive, mentally ill category of person who could not stay. And there were people like Sarah Harb Quiroz, who was denied entry at the US-Mexico border because she was wearing trousers. Her family was in Mexico. She traveled across the border for work and was asked if she is a lesbian. And she said, yeah, I have relationships with women. This was in the 1950s. And when she was denied entry, she actually got a lawyer and really challenged the case. And it went all the way up to the appeal level. And finally, in the early 60s, she married a man, put on a dress, and went back to the immigration officials and said, okay, you win. I'm heterosexual now. I'm not breaking any of your laws. And the immigration officials said, no, once a lesbian, always a lesbian. You're not allowed to enter the country legally. And it would be many decades before those restrictions in US immigration law shifted and took away those prohibitions on queer people entering the country. So a gay rights movement emerges that really coalesces around this idea that, yeah, we are a citizen group. We are a minority like there are racial minorities. We are an interest group that demands its equal rights. And they were responding to restrictions like what we call the lavender scare, when the federal government said that if you were gay or lesbian, you couldn't have a civil service job, and that trickled down to a lot of other parts of the workforce. They were struggling against employment discrimination. And this became known as the homophile movement. So they're here on the right, they're picketing in front of the Civil Service Commission building, but there were also pickets on the 4th of July here in Philadelphia in front of Independence Hall, and picketing with signs, I am a homosexual citizen. So saying things that might sound very sort of modest to us today but were an incredible risk for a person to take in the mid-1960s because of how severe the restrictions had become by then. It was no longer just police raiding a party in Long Beach. It was federal immigration law. It was Civil Service Commission policy and executive orders. It was a whole apparatus of the government by the mid-1960s saying that these are problematic identities that are not consonant with full American citizenship. So the movement becomes more militant. It really pushes against these limitations, saying it's not just that we want you to accept us, we want the world to make way for us, and maybe the way we do things is the way. So Carl Whitman wrote the Gay Manifesto, Out of the Closets and Into the Streets. But even before that, there was a riot in San Francisco of trans women at Compton's Cafeteria in 1966. There were, at Dewey's in Philadelphia, there were gender expansive kids who were denied service at the lunch counter and staged a sit-in. There was, of course, the Stonewall Uprising in New York City in 1969. But when Carl Whitman wrote this, he says, come out everywhere, initiate self-defense and political activity. So this is a call not to sort of politely picket in front of a government agency declaring your full citizenship, but to take to the streets and really bring about a social and cultural revolution. This led to organizations like Gay Liberation Front, committed to radical change and direct action. Radical feminism and lesbian feminism were often integrated and parallel parts of this gay liberation movement. And that's a whole other story about how the ways in which gay liberation in some ways ended up reproducing some of the male chauvinism of the society they critiqued, and in other ways was more radical. So Gay Liberation Philly was really progressive, and they argued against sexism. They said heterosexism, this idea that men are one way and women are one way, is toxic, and we have to get rid of that, and we just have to completely open ourselves up to the possibility of fluid gender if we will have any chance of achieving gay liberation. The liberation movement involved calls for economic equality, for access to reproductive health care, and there were parts of this movement that were incredibly expansive, drawing together all kinds of causes. One of the people I write about in my book, Kiyoshi Kuramiya, he helped found the Gay Liberation Front in Philadelphia, but he also worked with the Black Panthers to educate them about gay rights. And was quite successful in taking a group that had been known for being fairly homophobic and educating them about the ways in which both movements had a lot in common. So we see a movement then for LGBTQ rights. We start to talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender as identities, as communities of people. The federal government remains an important place to push for those rights and to push for a rethinking of the relationship between government and sexuality. Is the government the thing that's going to ensure queer rights? Is the government the source of the problem to start with? How much faith can queer activists put in the government to protect their interests? And my last slide of this section is that, to lead into my conclusion, is that this also involved the work of history. The first monumental contribution was a book called Gay American History, published in 1976 by Jonathan Ned Katz. Katz, who's still with us, is this sort of fearsome and tireless independent scholar who has devoted his entire adult life to collecting and documenting the gay past and creating opportunities for other people to do so. The professional organization, the Committee on Lesbian and Gay History, was founded in 1979. Soon there are academic journals about queer history. And there are one of the first historical societies, I don't know if it's the first, but a major one around today is the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. My point is that right from the start, preserving this history was part of gay liberation and movement building. the movement for gay rights, the movement to expand access to opportunity and to equality for all people, queer people, people of color, was also a movement about saving, collecting, preserving the history of the people who were involved and who came before them. So my conclusion, in very briefly, I want to point to some of the challenges we're facing today in trying to preserve that history. The current administration has gone through a sort of, I think, like a Command F style editing process to take the T and the Q's out of anything about LGBTQ history or resources on federal websites. So, for example, the National Monument of Stonewall now describes LGB people. Of course, trans people were at the Stonewall uprising. They were instrumental to the uprising and to the whole movement that went into and came out of that incredible uprising against police protest. There have been entire research projects removed from federal websites. So when I made this slide a couple months ago, you could still run a search on the National Park Service for LGBTQ America, and the Heritage Theme Study showed up. And what that means is the National Park Service will hire scholars, independent scholars, professional historians, all kinds of people to put together these massive resource guides to preserve the past, to collect resources about these histories in the United States. And this one also included another publication, the Pride Guide, which was an interactive workbook for exploring lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer history and places. So a resource for teachers and all kinds of educators about where this history exists in the United States. I regret that if you go and you try to click on that document now at the National Park Service, the page is not found. Now, many independent scholars and organizations downloaded the PDF and have it on their websites. You can still get copies of these theme guides, these theme studies, but they are no longer on the federal websites. Similarly, there's this documentary that I love about Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus. I showed you a slide of it earlier. It was a joint project of the New York City Public Schools and PBS. It still exists today on the New York City Social Studies and Civics Hub. It wasn't erased, but it is no longer on under PBS's resources. The way this is being done is really haphazard. There's still a lot of queer history on PBS and other federal websites. It's unclear to me why certain things have been erased and others happened, but it's a real problem for those of us who see the value in preserving it. So I want to end on a message of hope. And this is my friend Rodney Wilson. And this is my message of hope because this is one person. So he, in 1994, was teaching his high school students about the Holocaust. And in the course of teaching them about the different groups of people that the Nazis rounded up, he said, you know, if I had been there, I would have been rounded up because I'm gay. And he dealt then with reactions from the parents of his students and the administration. He kept his job. He became the first openly gay teacher in the entire state of Missouri, where he was living and teaching. And then he's the person who established Gay History Month, which we now call LGBTQ History Month, a following year. He just went around and called people and wrote letters and said, you know, we should be able to tell more about this. If I want to put a lesson plan together, I need to be able to find the resources. There has to be more history that we can share with our students, with our communities. So I'm very grateful to Rodney for having done that, and his work, which he's still doing to this day, is really inspiring. So thank you so much for registering and showing up for the talk. I'm really excited for your questions. This is my book here. I also have a semi-regular Substack newsletter called Carnal Knowledge, where I take current events and talk about the history behind them. There are free and paid subscriber versions of it. And I would, if you want to scan that QR code, you can become a subscriber. So thank you so very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. We're very early America focused at the library company, so I felt like I learned something as we got further along in history. I was particularly struck when you were talking about in the early American history how policing sexuality was about disorderly behavior. And just thinking about the way people talk about LGBT people now, it kind of feels like we've regressed to that mindset where they're trying to maintain like a well-ordered family unit. So that was really interesting. We
Yes, the well-ordered family language is in Project 2025.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how far back we've got. But we've got tons of questions coming in, so I'm just going to jump right into some of our audience questions. The first one we have is, what is the list of sex crimes you found in colonial US history? Any differences found with sex crimes listed in European countries in the same time period?
They would have been very similar. So the laws that were enforced, whether in Dutch colonies or English colonies, they were using the European precedents for that. Their exceptions were in places like colonial New Haven, which was very strictly following Old Testament language. So colonial New Haven was the only colony that prosecuted women for sodomy because their definition of it was anything that was, two people of the same gender. And the the thing that the colonies did differently, though, was to make the punishments more severe based on race. And that didn't exist in the European, in English common law or in the European statutes. But because of chattel slavery, and because of efforts to distinguish white people from Native Americans and so on, the definitions of these crimes and the punishments for the crimes became distinctive in North America when they involved sex across those divisions.
All right, our next question is, was any of the discrimination in the late 1800s related to the numbers of people immigrating into the US?
Yes, because there is always yes, it always is. So the laws against sex workers were ostensibly to there were laws that said that if you were found to be a sex worker or aiding a sex worker or trafficking, you could be deported. And it was supposed to be about this problem of white slavery, of European women being trafficked into American cities, or of American farm girls being trafficked into cities. But Mexican women were deported at a higher rate than any other ethnic group. So the enforcement of these laws shows us the ways that they aided and abetted whole systems of racial discrimination. And even the language of white slavery helps us understand the sort of racial politics of that. It's a big question. I talk about it a little bit in the book, but it is a really important big question.
Right, our next question is, there has been a lot of scholarship in American literary studies with respect to earlier queer research. Do historians draw on this research?
Yes, and there are wonderful journals like Early American Studies and 18th centuries. I can't remember all the names off the top of my head that are very interdisciplinary. So we have, both because a lot of the sources for the earlier period are literary sources. Bound objects are more likely to survive hundreds of years than individual scraps of paper that the average person would write. So we have excellent sources to work with from that period. And yeah, there's a lot of cross-cultivation of knowledge.
Our next person sent in 3 questions at once, so I'm going to break them up and not ask you them all at the same time.
Okay.
But their first question was, does your work include formerly enslaved queer persons, such as Frances Thompson, who was a trans woman activist, or William Dorsey Swan, the first person known to call himself a drag queen?
I am very familiar with both of the people you're mentioning. I don't think I talk about them in my book. So I'll give you a little foretaste of my book. It is 18 chapters covering 400 years, and the book is under 400 pages long. So each chapter is its own 20-page narrative. I focus on a particular person or group of people because I think that makes the stories easier to connect with, the history easier to connect with. So my book is in no way a comprehensive history of sex and sexuality in North America. I don't know that we could write that at this point. I think we know, and happily, we know so much about this history that it exceeds the bounds of a single volume. So I'm very familiar with the people you're talking about. They're fascinating characters, and unfortunately, no, they are not discussed in my book.
That is a call for our audience to look up more information about those two figures.
Yes, yes.
Their next question was, is it true that Ulysses Grant once rehearsed an address to perform the part of Desdemona in a production of Othello?
I think that's true, but I don't know for certain. Yeah, I think I've heard that as well. There's a
Another
lot of
thing,
cross-dressing, though. There's a lot,
yes.
I mean, like, especially in military settings, there's cross-dressing was very, very common.
And I'm glad you brought that up because their next question was about persons who cross-dress to be in the military and where that fits in queer history and your thoughts about that.
It's an exciting question in queer history. So, for example, someone like Deborah Sampson, who fought in the American Revolutionary War, the scholar Jen Mannion, who I know has done one of the library company's talks in the past, and they're a brilliant scholar of the 18th century. And Dr. Mannion has written about Sampson, and other numbers of other people are, and in the different ways that they told their life story and other people told the story. Sampson later marries a man and has children with him, but identified as a masculine person, as a male-gendered person, while serving in the Revolutionary Army, the American Army. So it's a really there are also questions for historians about, so historians in the 80s and early 90s wrote about women who cross-dressed in order to get jobs in the American West. And then in the second part of the 90s and since, scholars were like, maybe those were trans men who were moving west to live as their authentic selves. And so it's a very fruitful and ongoing conversation among scholars about how do we understand people how do we figure out what they thought they were doing? Not what we think they were doing, but what did they think they were doing? What did the people around them think about what they were doing? And what words do we have to describe it that really honor that experience that they had? So it's a really important question too.
Yeah. All right. Next question says, I love that you focus on Addie and Rebecca. Their story is also one in which class plays a central role. I'm wondering how you see class as a through line in your chapters on the 19th century.
That's a great question. So one of, I'm just sort of rewinding my chapters on the 19th century through my head. So one of the ways that it's important is even how we understand what resources or opportunities people had. So some of the folks that I write about had the privilege to preserve their documentation, their records, and that does create a bias in the archives to sort of be able, that's part of why it's so cool that we have Addie's letters, because very few working class people's letters exist. But there is exciting new work, and I do talk about it in my book about working class people's alternate ideas of marital happiness. So there's a new book out that I think might have come out right after my book did, so I couldn't cite it, about love in the working class. And it took the scholar 3 decades to write because
Wow.
she had to go to so many different archives to try to find anything like love letters among working class people to try to figure out, did they have the same sort of romantic ideals that we find in the copious love letters written by middle class Americans in the 19th century? And she finds, in fact, that they didn't. So the other place that class comes in is through conversations around sex work. And the way that sex work is an economic strategy for a lot of people, the way that it is prevalent within migrant communities. So, in the Pacific Northwest, among loggers and miners and people who are traveling around, and how vulnerable working class people and migrant workers are to state surveillance and arrest. So they're overrepresented in the arrest records and underrepresented in things like diaries and personal accounts.
All right. The last 3 questions I have are very specific, so
Okay.
no worries if you don't have the answers right away, but I will ask them for our audience anyway. So one person wants to know, is it known if any persons accused of witchcraft in Salem were also accused of sex crimes?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
And that is based on reading I did in 2001 for a graduate seminar with John Demos on colonial America. And I wrote my final paper on witchcraft. If there's been, and I've read a couple of the books that have come out since then, but my recollection is no, that there were not sex crime allegations. But I'm really drawing back pretty far.
Yes, totally fair. Someone asked, can you be more specific about the various sexual behaviors, activities that were considered criminal in the early American laws?
Sure. So bestiality, sodomy, which was not clearly defined. So what exactly sodomy was up for debate, um, and fornication, adultery. Those are the main sex-related crimes. People could also be prosecuted for things like uncleanness. And what exactly that meant was also up for debate. Oh, so for some of the women who were prosecuted in the 1600s, who were found in bed with one another, they were prosecuted for lewd speech and for uncleanness upon a bed. They weren't
Hmm.
prosecuted for a specific sex crime. So also people who were found to be passing around dirty pictures or to have sort of forbidden midwifery books in their possession that would have talked about female anatomy in ways not considered proper for the general population, they're not prosecuted for sex crimes, but they are brought before the church or brought before the law because of the things that they're talking about regarding speech. And so that's one of the, it's a little vague. I'm not being intentionally vague. The way that worked out, it was pretty vague. But interracial sex and interracial sex acts, various kinds, become the focus of a lot of those laws within about 100 years of settlement. Aside from still prosecuting, women are still prosecuted for fornication fairly often up through about 1750.
Um, It's wild how vague those categories are, and yet they still manage to prosecute people.
Yeah.
All right. Our next very specific question says, why don't we know about more about Carl Whitman?
Oh, he was a communist and a sex radical and a liberationist. He shows up in histories of gay liberation. I'd say you'd find him there. But if you Google him, a lot of his work is open source. So you can read his manifestos if you're interested and some of his other publications. I think it's called like The Red Butterfly or something like that was the name of his journal. A lot of that is available online.
All right, so we're just about at time, but one last question came in, so I'd love if we can get that one answered. So our final question tonight is, do you talk about Charity and Sylvia in your book? And if so, do you explore how religious and societal pressures in America affected the relationship dynamics between queer people?
So, for those who don't know, Charity and Sylvia lived for over 40 years together in New England in the first part of the 19th century. And the historian Rachel Hope Cleaves has written a beautiful book about their relationship. And they were also devout Christians and were part of their church congregation. And what Cleaves found in her research was that pretty much everybody knew that they were sharing a bed and a couple, and they helped raise various other younger family members and ran a business together. So I mentioned them. They are mentioned in my book in the same chapter where I talk about Rebecca and Addie. And I don't, unfortunately, get into the religious dynamics of that. I talk about religion more in a chapter about the debates over polygamy in the second half of the 19th century. So no, there's so many things that I wished I could have emphasized in the book, but it does have a lot of other stuff in it. I did what I could to tell a compelling story in every chapter.
Yes, and I, as someone who's read the book, I highly recommend it to our audience. It's a fascinating read. Even if you think you know a little bit about queer history, you're going to learn something if you read this book. So I just want to thank you again, Dr. Davis. This was a great presentation. I think our audience, I've gotten some comments that they were really excited. They thought this was a great presentation too. And I just want to thank one last time our Charlotte Cushman Society members for making events like this possible. We super appreciate all the money that's donated to get our speakers in and have them give wonderful talks like this one.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
All right, everyone, have a good evening.